So what was your involvement with Ric Ocasek? Was it on some of his solo album stuff, or?
We did a album with Ric Ocasek, an album called Fireball Zone
Yes.
in 1990 with the band, substantially with the band that we had as a house band for a TV show that Nile was on in the States called New Visions on VH1. And I was in the band, and that was sort of the core band for that project. I was thrilled to be working with and meeting Ric Ocasek because I was such a massive fan of his music, and I spent all kinds of time grilling him about aspects of the albums that meant the most to me, and he was very generous with his time in talking about them, and had brought in very, very sort of specific demos where my role was going to be very much to be Greg Hawkes as much as possible. To his thing, because that's what works and that's what's appropriate. Although there's an extent to which I do that, and that he presented that in the demos. And then there's an extent to which I was allowed to go off sort of into my own area. And I mentioned trans waves earlier. And it was one of the first years that I believe it was called a VFX at the time by Ensoniq had appeared. And that offered trans wave modulation synthesis in lieu of having resonant filters. And so I did manage to create some really nice pads for that album using trans wave modulation, because I was fascinated by the possibility and it was new. So I was like, let's do that, you know. And Ric was very interesting to work with. I can tell you a few things. For example, that Gibson SG guitar that you see him playing since Cars 1 had the same strings on it that it had when he bought it.
Wow.
And he was not going to change them. Now, Bernard Edwards used to do some version of this too, by the way. Some people get to like the way the string sound ages. And Ric is Ric is mostly jump guitars. And it works for that. It sounds great like that. And he didn't want new strings for that. And he was like, no, no, I do not want new strings for this guitar. And secondly, we got into a John and Marcia conversation. What is that? There's some piece of theater where these two people meet on a park bench and start into a conversation about their past, and they discover that not only did they know each other, but they're like former lovers or whatever. Like, John, Marcia, you know. All right, so Ric and I had a sort of a John and Marcia moment when we're talking, and I mentioned that I had lived in Boston for a while, or outside of Boston in Somerville. And he goes, oh yeah, I used to live in Somerville. Where did you live? And I said, I used to live off of Somerville Avenue. And he goes, that's funny. I used to live off of Somerville. Well, Somerville Avenue is pretty big. All right. So what street did you live on? Oh, I used to live on Spring. I used to live on Spring Street. So it turned out at the end of this John and Marcia conversation that Ric Ocasek and I had lived in the same house 8 years apart.
That is surreal.
Whoa.
It was a triplex, and he had lived on the first floor and I had lived on the third. So we didn't live in the same space in the same house, but we lived in the same house at the same address 8 years apart. And he was there with Ben Orr when they were forming the Cars.